back to Nerdiverse Christian Couples. We are a Nerdiverse Christian couple. I'm Stephanie.
I'm Dan.
And we have as our guest today, Michael Cusick. Thank you so much for being with us, Michael.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
All right, let me tell you guys about Michael. Michael is the CEO and founder of Restoring the Soul, an intensive counseling ministry in Denver. He is a licensed professional counselor, spiritual director, and former assistant professor of counseling at Colorado Christian University. Michael is also the author of Surfing for God, and his articles have appeared in such places as Relevant, Huffington Post, and Red Letter Christians. He and his wife, Julian, have 2 grown children and live in Littleton, Colorado. But today we are talking about Sacred Attachment, which was released this year, because this whole month, if you've been following along, listeners, with Dr. Wilder and Dr. Gill, we've been talking about all things attachment, and that's part of our discussion today. So, Michael, thank you again for joining us. Tell us a little bit about what led you to writing this book.
I wrote the book, Sacred Attachment, and the subtitle will be important, at least for this moment. The subtitle is Escaping Spiritual Exhaustion and Trusting Divine Love. And my experience has been personally, in terms of overcoming sex addiction 30 years ago, alcohol abuse. I'm now part of a 12-step group for compulsive overeating. So recovery, healing, and restoration has been a big part of my life. I wanted to be able to give people a language and a lens for my own journey, balanced with what I've learned clinically over 31 years of being a licensed therapist. I also like to say that I wrote it for people like my 27-year-old son who grew up in a Christian home and who has the date that he asked Jesus into his heart and the word saved, but today does not identify as being a follower of Jesus. I wrote it for people like that who have discovered or experienced a big gap in their lives, the gap between what they once believed or what they do believe and what they actually experience. And so I put language to that, which is to try to give people a language of the heart. And because of my own neurodivergence, that's something that I've struggled to learn, is to have a language of the heart, of the inner life and of the emotions. And God has a language of the heart, but then also a lens, and a lens of longing. I now understand the Christian scriptures not so much through a lens of particular doctrines, but through the fact that God's heart longs for intimacy and attachment with us, just as a healthy parent does with their child. And that our response to that in our human longing is to move toward him. And so there's no better way of connecting those two ideas of a language of the heart and a language of longing than through this idea of attachment.
Yeah, and I think many people have had an experience like you talk about in your book. In the first chapter, you talk about being at where some cloistered nuns are and some fear about being on the wrong side of God. And I really wrote, I like what you wrote about having this feeling that God's like against you and that he's just waiting for you to kind of mess up so he can zap you and get you. But then what you experienced in that place that day was not only the love of the nuns and other religious leaders there, but the love of God. So maybe tell us a little bit about that story when you kind of had that fear of, who God is, because a lot of us have had fear bonds with God, and then really coming to understand how much God loves you, delights you, and actually likes you, and where that maybe was part of your journey.
Yeah. And thank you, Stephanie, for making the distinction or the addition that God doesn't just love us, but that he likes us. That is a big, huge addition and part of attachment. I've always thought, well, it's kind of God's job to love me. So that doesn't seem to mean that much. And if God is God, they must be loving. But then to like me, wow, how does that happen? Because I don't like myself. So the story, the backdrop to that moment that I wrote about in the book was that it's a memory from age 4. And that same year, I began to be sexually abused by an uncle who was a sadistic man. And I had dealt with a lot of sexual abuse that I had never forgotten. But this came up back in 2003, and I thought I was crazy, and a lot of it was corroborated by siblings. When I started to write the book, I actually called one of the nuns. There were 18 nuns when I was growing up in this community, and there are 3 that are still alive as of today. And one of them is a Slovakian nun, Sister Bernadette. And I called her and I said, "Did this happen?" And she said, "Yes, I remember we used to do that." And there were times where with her nieces and nephews, they would have the same effect. And so I was the youngest of 5 Irish Catholic kids in an alcoholic family. And once a month we would drive way across town in Cleveland from the west side to the east side. And my aunt was a cloistered Carmelite nun. And they're like the Navy SEALs in the Catholic Church. They make vows of poverty, obedience, chastity, but they remove themselves from the world. And they are behind a metal grill that is like a waffle grid. And this has been that way since the 1500s. Teresa of Avila and others were the earliest Carmelites. And so we would visit and we'd be in this room that had a countertop, and over the countertop, there would be this big metal set of bars like prison, except it was crosshatched, and the nuns were on one side and visitors were on the other side. The only thing you could do is like poke your fingers and a small fist through. Off in the corner, there was a cabinet. You open the doors and there was a lazy Susan that spun around almost as big as a garbage can. And one day, while my siblings and I were messing around, my brother picked me up, put me in that cabinet, and started to spin me around. And this was obviously not allowed because they couldn't have contact. And I got dizzy, and to this day, I hate amusement park rides and felt nauseous and scared and terrified. And what's going to happen? Finally, that container stopped, and I thought, finally, Jimmy is going to take me out of here. But instead, the door opened to the side of the nuns, and my aunt, Sister Ann, embraced me and hugged me and lifted me out. And she ran her fingers through my hair and kissed me. And these weren't kind of old grandmotherly pinching my cheek hugs. There was just a joy and an affection. And the other nuns came around and they began to do the same. And then, I asked Sister Bernadette if I was making this up, and she said no. They pushed some tables and chairs out of the way, and they began to sing and dance Ring Around the Rosie with me. And it was just this surreal but beautiful moment, almost like I've been transported to heaven. But it happened in the context of one moment, everything was going okay. The next moment, I was spinning around and didn't know what was going to happen. Then I momentarily thought that the Pope or a bishop would show up and that I was going to, go to hell for what I was doing. But then there's this embrace. And I think that became a metaphor for me for all of life. And the theologian Walter Brueggemann, who has written over 80 books, he wrote a little book called Uncovering the Psalms. And he talks about how Jesus teaching through the life of Jesus and all throughout the Psalms in particular has the same pattern. He called it orientation, disorientation, reorientation. So life as we like it, life as we would never want it to be, and then a reorientation, which is like Easter, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter. So for me, what happened in that moment, age 4, I'm being sexually abused by my uncle, but God gave me this real but otherworldly experience of being on the wrong side of the bars, but being embraced by these loving women that would never have their own children, who had little contact with the public. And that became a template where I believe that somewhere deep down inside of my nervous system and in my DNA, there was this experience of being embraced in this utterly holy, beautiful context, and in particular by the feminine. So it was a very maternal love, but with 17 or 18 different women. And I think that my life would have turned out very different if not for that moment, that the way and the trajectory that the abuse went may have had a very different effect. And the sex addiction that I had might have become more severe more quickly. My alcohol abuse might have escalated. And in many ways, I might not be alive today if not for that. And so that's a story really of how in the midst of our lives, we're all in some sense of being disoriented or spinning or turned upside down or experiencing betrayal or living with neurodiversity, whatever it might be. But there's always these moments where God is present. And part of our work spiritually and psychologically and relationally is to have our eyes open to see where God is present and where love is present, where I might not see it. And in particular, it's been really difficult for me to actually embody a secure attachment because so often my body's dysregulated and activated, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners are aware of. But because of my neurodiversity, which I've only known about for 7 years, I have a perception or a lens where I'm seeing things that aren't really there. So it's particularly powerful when I see the presence of God, when it's not an obvious situation. And it's also super helpful to be able to know that sometimes I just have a very, very cloudy vision to be able to see something that that I'm interpreting incorrectly or filtering out, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's been a little bit part of your journey as well, right, hun? That being kind of feeling disembodied or not attached to your body. And if I'm not attached to my own body, how do I attach to God? Has that been kind of part of your journey as well?
That and, I think you spoke to it at the beginning of it. The intellectual connection only, perhaps the knowledge. I learn a piece of knowledge. I get like putting together a puzzle piece of someone, but what you're left with when you finish the puzzle is still a 2D image instead of an experience with engaging. If you're putting a picture together of your kid and then you got done with it and you've got a 2D picture of your kid in a instant, right? This is a snapshot of a moment. It's a lot different than have enjoyed a evening in the park with an ice cream cone or something like that, right? That's that's very different way to experience. And that's, when Stephanie told me about your book, I was like, wow, somebody's done this.
Well, I'm trying. And so back to your very first question, like I wrote this book for myself because I needed to put words to my own journey. And without really working through my own journey, it's been hard as a neurodiverse individual to trust, even in my neurodiversity, that I'm loved and that there's something there called this sacred attachment or secure attachment that actually has very little to do with me. And that's I know we use a lot of different language with this. And by the way, Dan, I love your analogy of the 2D, 3D versus going and having an ice cream cone, because ultimately when people talk about attachment, we can give all kinds of clinical definitions, but it's the idea of reading about somebody versus going and having an ice cream cone with them and actually hanging out and experiencing what they're like and feeling that in an embodied way. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Wasn't sure where I was going.
Okay. Well, we talked before we recorded that I guess for copyright, I'll say it's on page 6 of the book. The question I'm getting ready to read from your book is something that we are asked all the time. So when I saw this, it's highlighted, asterisk. it's like, this is the question. So you say in the book, how do human beings grow spiritually, emotionally, and psychologically? Basically, I want to know if people can change, if I can change without compromising the deepest, truest part of ourself. Yeah. So as a former therapist, now coach, and when I'm working with neurodivergent individuals, men or women, it's like, what's my neurodivergence? What's me? What's my character? What's my temperament? If you're saying we're going to change a little bit relationally in marriage, like what's going to change? And are you going to try to change me at the core? So that's kind of the question of the hour. So will you kind of walk us through how you began to answer that question?
Sure. And let me just preface this, and this is not false humility, because it's an author spiel of I want to sound humble. But my goodness, I'm still working on this, and I can give you some pretty good articulated ideas, but every single day, this is something that I have to work out. Every single time, my wife, Julianne, looks at me and I think she's mad at me, and she's really not. She's just caught up in her own thoughts. I've got to learn to check that out, to not take it personally, to not implode, to not get covered in shame, self-hatred, etc. The first thing in response to that is I believe with all my heart that people can change, and people do change. Dallas Willard used to say all the time, we are being spiritually formed all the time. It just is, what direction are we being spiritually formed? So we're changing for good or we're changing for bad. The second thing I would say is that the neurodiverse brain, in regard to attachment, has wonderful capacity and opportunity in some ways that neurotypicals don't have, precisely because of the struggle there. C.S. Lewis said that every disability reveals a vocation or a calling. And I like to say that every disability, or if you will, every neurodiversity in the context of your organization in this conversation on attachment, reveals a gift. We sometimes talk about that as a superpower or something like that. But here's what I mean. When a person knows that they have some kind of processing issue or attachment issue or predilection to detach, to not connect, whether that's eye contact or physical proximity. To know that is actually a tremendous gift. And therefore, rather than trying to, quote, strengthen weaknesses or vulnerabilities, I like to ask the question, and I'm trained in both pastoral counseling, I have a graduate degree, but a graduate degree in counseling psychology. And one of the distinctions about counseling psychology from clinical, they used to tell us, is counseling psychology is focused on strengths. It's strengths-based versus pathology-based. So I have this view of strengths. So the question is, if I've got an Asperger's brain where it's difficult to rest internally, it's difficult to find peace, it's difficult for me to slow my thoughts down. You know, every time I have 20 minutes of silence with Jesus, I write 5 books in my head. And you know, it's virtually impossible for me to quiet myself. Therefore, what's the opportunity in that? And the opportunity is, first and foremost, just by virtue of having the struggle, I'm vulnerable and I have limitations. And wherever there's vulnerability and limitation, as we surrender that to God, to the God that looks like Jesus, he loves to inhabit that. I like to say that, you know, everywhere where there is disfavor, everywhere where there is pain, where there's struggle, where there's lack, where there's poor in spiritness, those are all the places God loves to inhabit and make himself known. So really quickly shifting gears, and this might seem like a random thought, but I used to work in hospice where people were dying. And one of the things I learned there is that people in comas, it's not just that their hearing is the last to go. Doctors will often say, talk to the person in the coma or the person that's had the stroke, you know, because their hearing is the last thing to go. And I think it's greater than that. And a lot of the people that are not physicians, but nurses, actually believe that it's not the hearing, but the spirit, that the spirit of a human being is not the neurons. Spirit is that thing beyond the physical. The soul is indeed the body. But so our spirits, as neurodiverse people seeking to attach so that we can optimize our relationships and be connected in the way that we're created for and that deep down we long for, we can learn to nurture our spirit, to cultivate our spirit, and to see our spirit as actually a part of us that can lead our body, which might not read certain signals. And it can be a part of that longing that takes us into connection and attachment that is not cognitive, it's not right brain, it's not left brain, it's just pure spirit. And I even had a friend who, they lost a child at 4 years old after a long neurological illness. And this man was a worship pastor. And it sounds completely strange, but God called him out of the church and he started a ministry in upstate New York. He would travel around the country with his guitar and sing worship songs to people that had been in persistent vegetative states with no brain activity. And person after person, these people that, quote, they were certainly neurodiverse because they had no brain activity, but person after person, he would sing worship songs to them and tears would come down their face. Now, if that's not attachment, I don't know what is. And if that's not the spirit that's engaging relationally with God, but also in response to this man, I don't know what is attachment. And so therefore, I would just start this conversation with, let's talk about strengths and let's talk about how we can access the parts of us that are beyond all of the typical barriers that we think about. And so the 4 S's that Dan Siegel originally started to talk about and Kurt Thompson talked about in his book, The Soul of Desire, I really tried to unpack those and make that kind of the center point of the book. And so all attachment occurs to the degree that we're seen, that we're soothed, that we're safe, and then we have the potential to develop that secure attachment. And so for many people, especially in my experience with neurodivergence, how people change without compromising their true self is idiosyncratically, which means every person is individual. Is there a certain set of realities for how addicts overcome addiction? Yes, but they change idiosyncratically. Some people go to AA and they get help, and some people don't. And some people go to Celebrate Recovery or Smart Recovery. And the same is true with medication or any other form of treatment. And so I think the first thing is to say, well, what fires you up? What brings you joy? Where do you find passion? What do and who do you connect with? And then trying to fan those flames. And then finally, kind of alongside all of that, I would say that apart from whatever neurotypical or neurodiversity that people have, that there's a kind of brokenness above and beyond that, that is the brokenness of our story, the wounds that we've received, trauma. I know that your organization does a lot with trauma and how that impacts our brains and our relationships. But as we do that work around being aware of our brokenness, especially the relational brokenness, and then surrendering that, we have opportunity for healing there. And then whatever can't be healed can be entrusted to God and to others. And that becomes a really rich opportunity for relationship. So there's something beautiful that's developed in my marriage, even though we're still a work in progress after what will be 34 years this June, where there's a new kind of love that is developing. And for me, it's a deeper acceptance and trust in the fact that Julianne loves me with all of my neurodiversity. And certainly there's a lot of betrayal in the past 30 plus years ago that God has healed substantially. But for me, my work of deepening the attachment is she actually loves me, whereas the lies and the core beliefs of shame say there's no way that she could love me because there's something about me that's so flawed because of my Asperger's. And then on the other side, to have her more and more come to a place of deep acceptance that my situation is that trauma is not needing to be healed, because we once thought that if I did enough trauma counseling, that my brain and my ability to attach and connect would be just perfect. And that was not the case. But she's coming to have a deeper acceptance of who I am. And that leads to a deeper love on both sides of the equation. And it's something beautiful that isn't quite what we expected, but it's something that's really gratifying and brings joy. And I think a level of friendship is happening that we've not experienced before. And I think that's the attachment work that continues to happen. Not just we're communicating better or we're falling in love again, but true attachment that's happening. There's a security there that we're finding in one another.
Will you repeat those 4 S's from Dr. Thompson's work?
Yeah, you bet. It's seen, soothed, safe, and secure. And each of those words relates to a statement. So the caregiver or the parent, when they see the child, they're communicating in a lot of different ways of attuning. They're saying, I get you. That's the essence of being seen. It's not just a physical sense of being seen. We know through interpersonal neurobiology that the infant comes into the world with only 50 to 60% of the active neurons in their brain. So let's say that there's 40 billion neurons, and the rest of those come online, bing, 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 times 40 billion, as the parent or caregiver makes eye contact and attunes to the face. And even if the infant's eyes are closed in the first day or two, they don't have visual acuity, their brain is sensing that someone is beholding them and gazing upon them. And that effect of being seen turns on the remainder of the neurons over roughly the first 4 years. The second S is soothed. And that is where the caregiver or parent says, I've got you. So the baby's crying, the baby's hungry, the baby is in pain or has a wet diaper, and they attune and they see and they show up and they say, I've got you. Junior falls off the tricycle, or I remember I was 8 years old and I got hit in the eye with a baseball, and I had to go to the emergency room. And my mom, who had a lot of issues and there were a lot of separation between us for a number of years in my life. But one of the things she did really well was physical caregiving. She was in the medical field and took me to the emergency room. And there was a sense of, I've got you, I've got you. And that infant needs that, and the adult needs that. We need that from womb to tomb. And then safe, that sense of, I've got this. Here's the situation, this circumstance where you're powerless, where you're helpless, where you're out of control, where you can't take care of yourself because you're dependent. And I've got this allows the child to exhale and to be in a place of rest, calm, quiet, and content. Why? Because their needs are being attended to. And then those first 3 S's of seen, soothed, and safe allow for there to be a secure attachment, not just emotionally, but neurobiologically. And that's just been a really helpful framework as I think about any kind of work with people.